The Eastern European aesthetic, the endless blocks of grey, decaying buildings, dead trees saggily rising from the mud, and teenage gopniks squatting with cigars and bottles of vodka, blasting hard bass music, have become somewhat of a default factoid in online meme culture. Some may connect this imagery with a weird sense of nostalgia, but the main consensus, especially among Westerners, is that these so-called commie blocks are ugly, depressing, and horrible, and therefore an amalgamation of everything communism has to offer. Hell, even our fellow traveling content creator, living ironically in Europe, expressed his disdain towards this aspect of growing up in Serbia.
The worst of this happened in central and southern Serbia, as well as Kosovo, but it's very much present in Novi Sad, which before World War II looked amazing, and now if you go outside of the center, it's just... yeah. Which again is such a huge shame and really pains me, as Serbia could have been as pretty and had more tourists as other European countries if this wasn't the case.
One of the most popular Russian lore creators, No Fuckers, even went so far as to refer to them as
kind of like a plague that encompasses all of these territories and even goes as far as Western Europe, for example Germany.
But what if I told you that this impression is kinda misguided and maybe even a bit ungrateful? As someone who grew up in a commie block myself and has done a fair bit of research about the actual logic and context behind Soviet urban planning, I'm sure that I can change your mind. Hell, I'm certain that by the end of the video, we'll agree that so-called commie blocks were actually a tremendous feat of urban planning and were nothing short of a miracle for the people who first got to see them and live inside them back in the day. But to help you understand why anyone would ever claim such a preposterous thing, we'll first need to put things into perspective. More precisely, we'll take a look at the context in which these infamous buildings came to be. The first step in understanding the nature of the notorious commie block is to take a look at how things were before they emerged, at the time before socialism itself. We need to equate ourselves with the material conditions in Eastern Europe before the Communist Revolution took the world by storm, and how people actually used to live like in the various monarchist and Tsarist regimes. By all accounts and metrics, pre-socialist Eastern Europe, including parts of Asia included in the Soviet Union, as well as the Balkans, were and pretty much always have been far behind all of Western Europe. And by far behind, I literally mean over 100 years behind the socioeconomic developments and conditions of developed Western countries. While the West was industrializing and urbanizing, on the account of the wealth accrued through the process of primitive accumulation, which was fueled by centuries of colonial and settler colonial plunder and exploitation, the rest of the world, including Eastern Europe and Asia, had a very different path of development. While the West benefited, they were in fact on the receiving end of the emerging force of capitalist imperialism. All of their natural resources, as well as their agricultural and basic industrial produce, were in various ways being used and exploited for the needs and interests of primarily Western imperial powers. Nothing about their backwardness and maldevelopment was of their own making, however. As capitalism was ripening beyond its monopoly stage and beginning to transcend the national confines of countries such as the UK, France, and Germany by the year 1900, Eastern Europe and Asia were stuck in archaic conditions, with a semi-feudal, purely agrarian economy that had very little to no industrial output and was in many ways dependent on Western capital, which was ruthlessly expanding at their expense. This was of course done with the help of local comprador elites, which sold their souls and their nations to the whim of Western capital, in exchange for unchallenged local rule, as long as they behave and maintain the system that degrades and exploits their own people. For more insights into how this crucial historical stage shaped the destiny of all Eastern European countries and their eventually depressing and grey socialist aesthetic, take a look at my video on the question of why communism is so depressing and grey. For a more focused perspective, you might also find my video on the history of Yugoslavia quite interesting, and for a more modern context, make sure to take a look at this one. The conclusions of any of those videos can help us answer the key question: of why Eastern Europe was so poor and backward to begin with. With that cleared up, it quickly becomes clear why communist revolutions first happen in that impoverished second and third world in the imperial periphery, and why commie blocs sprang like mushrooms after rain precisely there and not in the West. It shouldn't then be surprising that with such a geopolitical predicament, the laboring population of these countries was living in very archaic and primitive conditions. The vast majority of people were peasants, living in villages, with little to no basic infrastructure and access to basic utilities. Cramped, transgenerational living spaces with shared outdoor toilets were the norm. The few that lived in the cities got to experience all the wonders of early capitalist industry and its cramped and inhumane working and living conditions, often accompanied with raging homelessness and pauperism. Housing solutions were insufficient, ineffective, and owned by a small minority of parasitic landlords. The October Revolution and subsequent civil war, necessitated and summoned by decades of Tsarist misery, exploitation, and poverty, combined with collective efforts of Western nations to drown the revolution in blood and destroy the Soviet Union through invasion and all imaginable forms of sabotage, only deepened the already dire situation. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 made an already intolerable housing situation even worse. The war caused widespread poverty destruction in the eastern part of the USSR. According to Soviet figures, 1,710 cities, towns, and urban settlements were fully or partially destroyed, as were many thousands of villages. More than 25 million people were left homeless. Leningrad, Kiev, Minsk, Smolensk, Stalingrad, and other cities and towns had to be almost completely rebuilt from heaps of broken brick and rubble. Solutions were needed quickly. What these Eastern Bloc countries didn't have compared to Western Europe was the privilege of American loans, aid, and capital, those divine spoils that managed to reset German industry in no time and realigned all Western European productive forces with American capital interests, concretely manifesting itself in the form of the European Union. The Eastern Socialist Bloc was not only excluded from the famous Marshall Plan, but was actively cut off and excluded from all European economical and political currents. The beginning of the Cold War meant the advent of isolation, embargoes, political pressures, and efforts at sabotage and subversion against the newly established socialist states, despite their valiant and incomparably tragic sacrifice and heroism in the fight against fascism. With no American capitalist sugar daddy or wealth accumulated through centuries of colonial plunder, the Socialist Bloc had to find its own solutions to kickstart the economy, build their productive forces, industrialize and urbanize as quickly as possible. As Joseph Stalin is often quoted saying, "We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or they crush us." The accompanying force to this unfathomable industrialization of the ravaged and backward economy was the proletarization of the majority peasant population, which led to the rapid urbanization of old and new economic centers. This kind of dramatic ethnographic shift, of course, required effective and quick urban planning. So, considering this context, the Soviet-era urbanization projects, which occurred in several phases from the 30s to the 1980s, were fascinating to say the very least. These ambitious undertakings transformed ravaged post-war ruins into thriving metropolises, which managed to house pretty much everyone, with virtually zero homelessness to be seen in any former socialist state. The Soviet Union undertook one of the most massive centrally controlled and planned policies for human and industrial resettlement in history. Since 1926, the Soviet government had built more than 1,400 new towns in which more than 50 million people live, work, and play. During the first 5-year plans, it reached the highest urban concentration rate ever recorded before World War II in any major country. By 1977, the Soviet Constitution officially guaranteed its citizens the right to housing through Article 44. Now, compare all of this to modern, peacetime capitalist economies which have all of the necessary resources and housing units to house absolutely everyone, which lay completely vacant, while there are millions of homeless and jobless people lying on the street. So, how did they actually do it then? Well, the basis of those accomplishments is their political approach towards housing. Instead of focusing on maximizing landlord revenue and squeezing out as much rent out of tenants regardless of the consequences, socialist countries insisted on more humanist principles, like, providing everyone with a roof over their head, no questions asked. Despite many issues, drawbacks, and humanist challenges facing any industrializing society, compared to the state of affairs in the initial industrial revolution in the Western world, the Soviet approach turns out to be a lot more humane. Despite obvious corruption and bureaucratic abuses due to still existing social stratification, they nonetheless focused on assuring equal opportunities for housing, equalizing the standard of living of different social groups, creating the working class basis for provincial cities, etc. In the Soviet view, objectives of planning on a massive and comprehensive scale are founded on a philosophy that regards the satisfaction of human and social needs as the primary objective. As it was agreed upon back then, the whole science of city planning must be placed in the service of man. Even though this utilitarian approach often clashed with individualist desires and lacked many charms of organic urban development, all socialist countries ended up providing both very affordable housing and a very high rate of home ownership to millions of people. Both of these concepts are pretty much inconceivable to the modern working class person, whose place of residence isn't placed quote-unquote in the service of man, but in the service of landlords and capital. So, how exactly did they solve the insane housing shortage? Well, for one, mass-owned housing units of the local bourgeoisie and aristocracy were expropriated and redistributed to those in need. The leeches and parasites of society had lost their massive properties, so that everyone who actually works gets a roof over their head as quickly as possible. On the other hand, the entire process of creating housing units was standardized and industrialized, fueled by innovative architectural and urban planning solutions, which solved issues of efficiency, price, and speed. Thus began the industrial production of standardized, prefabricated concrete panels on a massive scale, which could be shipped and assembled very quickly without the need for skilled labor, despite delays and abuses in bureaucratic decision-making. And so, the infamous Khrushchevka, Brezhnevka, and all other subsequent variants were born. Quality was to be sacrificed for quantity. Khrushchev asked, "Do you build 1,000 adequate apartments or 700 good ones? And would a citizen rather settle for an adequate apartment or wait 10 to 15 years for a very good one?" The leadership must proceed from the principle of using available material resources to satisfy the needs of the people as soon as possible. So, as bland as these blocks may seem to us from a modern Western perspective, they were a testament to hitherto unseen sociological progress, led by a doctrine of scientific functionalism. The approach included 4 general but basic elements characteristic of socialist urban planning, namely standardization, proper size of a town, the city's center, and the neighborhood unit concept, all of them more closely explained in this paper. Besides a few suboptimal examples, they encouraged communal housing and coexistence, and bonded local communities in a way completely alien to modern capitalist housing solutions. The proposed collective way of life, with its concentration of state-owned public services, led architects to invent a dom comuna, or house commune, which was practically a dormitory for workers. A house commune was to be equipped with all the facilities for living, including cultural and sports facilities. The broader city blocks were essentially self-sufficient subregions that were centrally planned to have everything one could ever need on a daily basis nearby, accessible, and in walkable distance. Assembled buildings were fitted into a designed housing district that the Soviets called a microborough. The microborough consists of residential superblocks and was conceived as a self-sufficient unit containing the essential social and cultural services for as many as several 100,000 people. Microboroughs were to be located on the peripheries of city cores, to which they would be tied by transportation arteries, and to which they would look for the major administrative, commercial, and cultural services. These connections were often achieved with reliable and cheap public transport, often on a very massive scale. Take Moscow's incredible metro system as a prime example of this. Close proximity to rural lands, water bodies, and forests would provide for interaction with nature. The inclusion of vast spaces, greenery, sports facilities, parks, and playgrounds made them a lot more livable and humane than many modern, low and medium income neighborhoods found both in advanced and quote-unquote developing capitalist countries and ex-socialist ones, which recently underwent capitalist restoration. Nowadays, you will often find these shiny, polished, modern-looking apartment complexes with, in reality, astronomical rent prices, cramped spaces, little sunlight, bad connections and overall traffic flow, terrible infrastructure, drowning in concrete and parking lots. Take these shameful scam apartments in modern Russia, mentioned by No Fuckers as an example. Those have exactly zero excuses for failure, and yet manage to under-deliver compared to efforts of the USSR of almost 100 years ago in unfathomably harsher conditions. For an example of inhumane, profit-oriented, and irrational urban planning in the developed world, you need not go any further than the infamous American suburbs, which have been criticized countless times here on YouTube. But the reason for this dichotomy is actually very simple. In the Soviet Union, housing is regarded primarily as a social good, while in the United States, it is treated essentially as a commodity. Opposed to these displays of supposed capitalist innovation and modernity, in the new settlements and cities that were built from the ground up in the Soviet Union, the underlying theme of every plan is that the city is planned as a single architectonic and social organism, so that all the features are subordinated to a single comprehensive idea. Although the results are easily criticized for their homogeneity, uniformity, or monolithic appearance, the look of each district can be deceptive. One set of 10-story slabs with open spaces between could be a thriving, desirable area, with schools, clinics, and public transport better than anywhere in Britain. Another may be a grim, gradually subsiding post-industrial waste with rotting joints and minus infrastructure or facilities. The conditions and quality of these housing units improved as time went on, with the very initial ones during the Stalin era personifying the dire state of affairs in those circumstances. But in case you're thinking how conformist and uncritical everyone in the USSR must have been towards these endeavors, think again. Soviet architects, government officials, and citizens are the harshest critics of Soviet housing construction. They complain about the dreariness of building design. One Soviet official explained the situation. There are many reasons for inferior work, but the most typical one is the desire to just get done with the project. The main thing is to hand over the building on or ahead of schedule. That is why quality is sacrificed right and left in the scurry to meet the deadline. When it comes to the size of living space, huge improvements were made compared to the initially dire situation. Housing was primarily measured by the number of square meters of quote-unquote living space per person, which includes bedrooms and the living room, but not the kitchen, bathroom, corridors, and storage space. Each of the 15 republics of the USSR had determined by law the minimum housing standards for its citizens. In the 1920s, the per capita living space was de facto around 5.5 square meters per person, whereas by the 1980s it almost doubled to around 9.5 across the top 30 largest cities. Apartments that had to be shared by several families at once could now be reserved for a single family living on their own, a significant improvement. Taken in their totality, though, these buildings were actually very robust, weather-resistant, with very good longevity, especially compared to the irresponsibly cheap, half-ass buildings where modern construction companies cut corners by saving on materials and ignoring safety regulations, for the sole purpose of turning a profit. But why do commie blocks look like shit and are rotting like a bag of potatoes nowadays then? Well, that's what 30 years of neglect looks like. The new capitalist establishment that inherited them simply has no interest in maintaining or refurbishing the housing units because it's just simply more profitable to build 10 fancy modernist apartment buildings that barely anyone can afford. They therefore let them crumble under the weight of time, giving them this distinctly depressing and dystopian look. This gives them yet another excuse to slander socialism for dystopianism, which they encourage with their own neglect. And the fact that these neighborhoods are nowadays the definition of Eastern European ghettos and slums has literally nothing to do with their socialist origin or that system's failures. It's directly a result of the societal rot and decay that came with the restoration of capitalism and disrespect and neglect towards everything that our peoples have achieved in socialism in those very tough times. This is not to say that there was not a degree of mismanagement and neglect on the side of the communists, though, especially in the later years. Far from it. But overall, with a little touch of paint and basic maintenance, these blocks can outshine even the most fancy feats of modern architecture in functionality and even looks. A testament to the quality of these apartment buildings were the reactions of people who, until very recently, had no access to electricity or drinking water, and shared outdoor toilets but could now live in clean, well-separated and spacious housing units, which to many looked like science fiction. In many regards, commie blocks were a civilizational leap forward, and criticizing them for their lack of artistic or architectural flair and decoration in light of this historical context is a bit ungrateful, to say the least. Even the most cynical interpretations of these urbanization projects as vast, cheap storage units for people, it's undeniable that they solve the deep crisis that the feudalist and bourgeois order never even bothered to address. Of course, the monolithic, utilitarian approach left a lot to be desired, and there should always be room for criticism regarding artistic and architectural expression, regarding the blandness and sterility of some of these neighborhoods, regarding their effects on the more individualist, adventuralist, and irrational parts of the human psyche. But, as it is the case with everything, we mustn't forget the material conditions and context of the things we criticize. And in this context, any home is better than no home.